A millionaire is unexpectedly drawn to a single mom of two. When he realizes who she is, what he did leaves everyone shocked. Before we start, leave a comment below telling us which city you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. The streets of the city were always bustling with life, but today Chris Kars, a reclusive millionaire, was feeling more detached than ever. His luxury car smoothly glided through the busy roads of downtown, the tinted windows shielding him from the chaos outside. Inside, the air was crisp with the scent of fresh leather, and his mind wandered between the board meetings awaiting him and the personal emptiness that seemed to grow with every passing day. Chris wasn't one for distractions, not on days like today. He had a tight schedule, but as he approached the intersection near the park, something, or rather someone, caught his eye. It was a woman sitting on the cold pavement. Her clothes were ragged, her face pale and worn from the weight of the world, and beside her, two children huddled together, their small faces tired and hungry. The sight would have been just another unfortunate scene in the city, one that many would pass by without a second thought. But for Chris, this moment stopped time. His car slowed, not because the light was red, but because he couldn't tear his gaze away from the woman. There was something hauntingly familiar about her. The way her head was tilted as if weighed down by years of hardship, the way her eyes stared vacantly at the ground, yet they seemed to flicker with a sense of recognition. As the light turned green, his foot instinctively hovered over the pedal, but his mind was elsewhere. A flash of memory hit him like a wave, cold and sharp. That woman's face, the soft curve of her jaw, the subtle way her eyes once sparkled with life, was unmistakable. He knew her. He had known her. Catherine. It had been years since he last saw her, but the name rushed back to him in an instant. Catherine Harris. His childhood friend. The girl he once thought he'd marry. His heart raced. How could this be? How could she be here? On the street? Begging for help with two children in tow. Chris's thoughts were a whirlwind. His mind tried to piece together what had gone wrong, but there was too much to consider, too much to process. He didn't even notice that the car had stopped completely, the engine idling in the middle of the road. The world around him continued its frantic pace, but in this moment, nothing mattered but the woman sitting on the sidewalk. A few cars honked behind him, pulling him back to reality. But even as his foot pushed the gas pedal forward, Chris's eyes never left Catherine. A twinge of guilt gnawed at him. He had everything: wealth, power, success, and she had fallen so far. Was this just a coincidence, or was fate trying to tell him something? The weight of the moment pressed down on him. What had happened to Catherine? How did she end up here, destitute and alone? The memory of their last encounter, so long ago, felt like a distant dream. Back then, they were inseparable. Young, full of ambition, with dreams of the future in their eyes. But life, as it often does, pulled them in different directions. Chris had gone on to become a successful businessman, amassing a fortune with his cutthroat approach to the world. Catherine, on the other hand, had faded from his life, and the last he'd heard, she was struggling to keep afloat after a personal tragedy. But this was a shock he hadn't prepared for. His hand gripped the wheel tighter. He had everything he could ever need, and yet seeing Catherine in this state awakened something in him. A sense of responsibility, maybe even guilt. He was still processing the shock of the encounter when his mind made up its decision. He had to do something. With a deep breath, Chris made a snap decision. He pulled over to the side of the road, his car now parked just a few feet from Catherine and the children. He felt a strange mixture of fear and urgency bubbling inside him. What was he doing? He had no idea. But he couldn't just drive away. He couldn't just leave them there. For a moment, he just stared. And then, without thinking, he opened the door and stepped out. The cool air hit him like a splash of water, and he took a hesitant step toward the woman who had once been such an important part of his life. As he approached, he could see the full extent of her situation. The children's thin coats, their faces gaunt from hunger, and Catherine's tired eyes, which flickered with something he couldn't quite place. He paused for a second, his heart racing. Should I call the police? Should I offer money? But as soon as their eyes met, everything else fell away. Catherine, he asked softly. Her head snapped up, her gaze locking onto his. Recognition flickered across her face, and her mouth parted as if she was about to speak, but the words didn't come. The years between them seemed to vanish in an instant. Chris's voice broke the silence again, more urgently this time. It's me, Chris. Chris Kars. For a moment, Catherine's expression was blank. The years of hardship had changed her so much that he wasn't sure she'd remember him. But then, like a spark of recognition, her eyes softened. Slowly, she stood up, her body trembling with a mixture of disbelief and exhaustion. "Chris," she whispered, her voice hoarse, as though she hadn't spoken in days. And there they stood, two people who once shared a lifetime of memories, now staring at each other across the gap of years, distance, and broken dreams. For a moment, time seemed to freeze between Chris and Catherine. The world around them continued in its usual hurried rhythm, cars honking, people rushing by, but for the two of them, everything else faded. It felt as if the years had dissolved in an instant, leaving only the two of them standing there, suspended in this strange, surreal moment. Catherine blinked, taking a cautious step toward him. The expression in her eyes was a mixture of disbelief and confusion. Her hands trembled as she pushed a strand of messy hair behind her ear, revealing a face so different from the vibrant woman Chris had known. He studied her closely. Gone was the carefree spirit he remembered, the spark of ambition and dreams they once shared. Instead, the woman standing before him was a shadow of her former self. Her clothes were threadbare, stained by time and the elements, and her eyes, those same eyes that had once lit up with laughter, now seemed hollow, weary, as though life had stolen her joy piece by piece. And yet, even though the veil of hardship clung to her, there was no mistaking it. It was Catherine. "Catherine," Chris repeated, his voice softer now, almost as if testing the name on his lips. He took a step closer, his heart pounding in his chest, as if meeting her again would somehow bridge the chasm of time and lost moments. She took a breath, her gaze flickering with something unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for the words that would break the silence. But Catherine was the first to speak. "Chris," she whispered again, as if saying his name aloud would confirm the impossible. Her voice cracked with emotion, a soft tremor of disbelief running through her words. "Is it really you?" Chris nodded, his throat tightening. "Yes, it's me. I didn't expect this. I never imagined I'd see you like this." He wanted to say more, to explain how he'd always wondered what had happened to her, to tell her that he thought about her sometimes, especially during lonely nights when success felt like an empty prize. But the words never came. Instead, there was a long pause. Catherine didn't seem to know what to say either. Her gaze dropped to the ground for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't expect to see you either. After everything that happened." Chris felt a sharp pang in his chest at her words. Everything that happened. He knew she was referring to the way they'd parted all those years ago. Their friendship, once so full of promise, had ended in silence, leaving so many things unsaid. So many unanswered questions. He had never understood exactly why she disappeared from his life, but it was clear now that there was a lot more to her story than he had ever known. I don't know what happened to you, Catherine," Chris confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "The last time we spoke, you seemed like you were on the verge of something, but then you just vanished. I never wanted to lose touch. I've thought about you over the years. I didn't know how to reach you." Catherine's expression softened at his words, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed like the old Catherine was still there beneath the years of hardship. Her eyes glistened with something that resembled regret, but also a kind of deep sorrow. "It wasn't you, Chris," she replied, her voice barely audible. "It wasn't your fault. I made choices. I made mistakes." Chris could feel the weight of her words, but he didn't know how to respond. He couldn't imagine what her life had been like after they parted ways. It seemed impossible to reconcile the vibrant, intelligent young woman he remembered with the broken figure in front of him. "I'm sorry, Catherine," he said quietly. "I had no idea. I never imagined." "I never wanted you to know," she interrupted, her voice suddenly sharp, as if she was trying to shield herself from his pity. "I didn't want anyone to know. I didn't want anyone to look at me like this." Chris took another step closer, his heart aching for her. He had no idea what she had been through, but seeing her now in this state made something inside him stir, a need to help, to make things right, to do something, anything, to change the course of her life. Before he could say anything more, one of the children, who had been sitting quietly by her side, hugging her knees, looked up at him. The little girl's wide eyes studied him with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. She looked no older than 5 or 6, her face pale and dusted with dirt. "This is Emily," Catherine said softly, her voice breaking. She put an arm around the child, pulling her closer. "And that's her brother, Liam." Chris's gaze shifted to the boy, who was clinging to his mother's side, his face turned down in embarrassment or shyness. Both children looked like they hadn't eaten in days. Their clothes, though not as tattered as Catherine's, were thin and ill-suited for the cold. Chris felt an overwhelming surge of responsibility. These children, her children, were caught in this cycle of despair, and there was only one person in the world who could help change their fate. But what could he do? What could he possibly offer? As if reading his thoughts, Catherine spoke again, her voice low but filled with something more desperate now. Please, Chris. I don't know what to do anymore. I've tried everything. But I can't. I can't do this alone. The words hung in the air, the weight of them suffocating him. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know what was the right thing to do. But one thing was clear. He couldn't walk away. The soft hum of the street noise faded as Chris's mind drifted, carried away by the weight of the past. Standing there in front of Catherine, everything he thought he knew about her, the woman he had once shared his dreams with, began to blur and reshape. Memories from a simpler time rushed to the forefront of his mind, as vivid as if they had happened only yesterday. The city streets he once walked with Catherine were nothing like the cold, indifferent concrete jungle they had become now. Back then, the neighborhood they grew up in was full of life and possibility. They had been inseparable, two souls bound by shared ambitions and an unspoken promise that they would always be there for one another. It was the summer before high school graduation, and Chris could still remember the way Catherine's laughter filled the air as they sat on the grassy hill overlooking their neighborhood. The world felt endless back then, the future stretching out before them like a blank canvas waiting to be painted with their hopes and dreams. So, what's next for us? Catherine asked, her eyes bright with excitement as she tossed a stone into the creek below them. Her dark hair caught the sunlight, and in that moment, Chris couldn't help but marvel at how beautiful she was, how full of life. She had always been the dreamer, the one who believed anything was possible, and Chris had followed her lead, believing with all his heart that they would build a future together. Chris turned to her, a grin spreading across his face. College, of course. You know, the Ivy League. I've got my eye on a scholarship to MIT. Catherine rolled her eyes playfully. MIT? You're such a nerd, Chris. He laughed, nudging her shoulder. Hey, I can't help it if I'm brilliant. She smiled back at him, but there was something deeper in her eyes, something he couldn't quite read. I think you'll get in. You always get what you want. I'm not so sure about that, Chris said, his smile faltering slightly. It's a lot of pressure. Catherine leaned in closer, her face serious for the first time that day. You'll make it. You're the smartest person I know. Chris shifted uncomfortably, his mind racing with doubt. But Catherine had always been his greatest supporter. He had never doubted her belief in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. The conversation shifted to their plans for the future. They talked about what they wanted to do after graduation, about the life they would build. Catherine wanted to be a journalist, to tell the stories of the underdogs, the ones no one paid attention to. Chris's ambition was focused on technology, building systems that could change the world. They both had dreams bigger than their circumstances, and they believed that together they could conquer anything. But somewhere along the way, things started to change. It was gradual at first, little shifts that Chris barely noticed until they became too big to ignore. Catherine's laughter had become less frequent, and her dreams seemed to shift into something more distant, harder to grasp. As the months passed, she grew more withdrawn, more secretive. She started missing school, and Chris could see the sadness in her eyes that she tried to hide. He knew something was wrong, but she never let him in. One day, just weeks before graduation, Catherine showed up at Chris's house with a look in her eyes that he would never forget. Her hands were trembling, and her eyes were red-rimmed, like she hadn't slept in days. I need to talk to you, she said quietly, her voice strained. Chris's heart raced as he led her to the kitchen. He had never seen her like this before. The girl who had once been so full of life and optimism was now standing before him, broken and fragile. What's going on, Catherine? You're scaring me. Catherine took a deep breath, her eyes darting away. I'm pregnant, Chris. The words hit him like a punch to the gut, and for a long moment he couldn't speak. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, everything around him spinning. Catherine pregnant? The woman who had always been so carefree, so full of dreams. How could this happen? I don't know what to do, she continued, her voice trembling. I don't know how this happened, but I can't do this alone. I don't know who else to turn to. Chris felt his stomach drop. He knew that this was the turning point, the moment that would forever change the course of their lives. He wanted to say the right thing, to offer her reassurance, but the words felt hollow. He didn't know how to help her, how to fix this. What about your parents? He asked, his voice distant. They'll help you. They have to. I can't tell them, Catherine whispered, tears streaming down her face. They won't understand. I've already let them down so much. I can't add to it. Please, Chris. I need you. I don't know what to do." Chris looked at her, the weight of her plea sinking deep into his chest. In that moment, everything changed. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't walk away from her now. But as much as he wanted to be there for Catherine, he also knew that their futures, his and hers, were now on separate paths. He had dreams of his own, dreams that seemed so far removed from the reality she was facing. And deep down, Chris feared that his world, the world he had built for himself, could never align with the one Catherine was now part of. That night, they said their goodbyes, not knowing it would be the last time they would see each other for years. Catherine disappeared from his life, and Chris focused on his future, on his business ventures, his rise to power, and his success. But the memory of her never left him. It haunted him, the way her face had looked that day, the way she had clung to him, desperate for help. Chris stood there, lost in his thoughts, his eyes fixed on Catherine as she gently brushed a tear from her cheek. The children, Emily and Liam, had curled up at her feet, their tired eyes watching the adults with quiet curiosity. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, and every part of him wanted to reach out, to pull Catherine away from this life that had clearly broken her. But he wasn't sure if he had the right to. Was he the one to save her? Or was he just an outsider, someone who had lost touch with the girl he once knew? The world around them seemed to grow quieter, as if it too was waiting for something to happen. The tension in the air was palpable, and Chris could feel the old connection between them stirring, but it was different now, charged with the complexities of the years that had passed. Catherine shifted uncomfortably, sensing the unease between them. Her eyes flickered down to the ground, her hands wringing the edge of her worn coat. "Chris, she began, but the words caught in her throat, and she looked away. She had always been strong, or at least she used to be, but now it felt like she was crumbling right in front of him, and he didn't know how to catch her. "I know," Chris said softly, interrupting her. "I know you've been through things I can't even imagine. And I'm sorry. I never should have lost touch with you. I should have done something." Catherine shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, Chris. It's not your fault. I made choices. I made mistakes. And now I don't know how to fix any of it." The sorrow in her voice struck him to his core. He could see the walls she had built around herself, the armor she wore to protect whatever was left of her spirit. It was clear that Catherine had fought long and hard to survive in this broken world, but somewhere along the way, she had lost her way. And now, she was asking for help. But what could he offer her that she didn't already have? What could he possibly do that would change the course of her life? But as Chris looked down at Emily and Liam, these innocent, fragile children who had been caught in this mess, he knew that his life could never be the same again. This wasn't just about Catherine anymore. This was about them, about the future. His heart tightened as he watched Emily clutch her mother's hand, her tiny fingers wrapped around Catherine's worn and tired palm. This little girl, so full of innocence, didn't deserve this life. And neither did Liam. No child should have to endure this kind of hardship. They needed a chance, a real chance at something better. The question gnawed at him. Could he really walk away from all of this? "Catherine," Chris began, his voice firm, but filled with emotion. "You don't have to do this alone anymore. You don't have to keep fighting on your own. I'm not going to pretend I know what you've been through, but I can help. I can help you get back on your feet. You and the kids. I'm offering you a way out of this." Catherine's eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief crossing her face. You would do that? After all this time? After everything Yes, Chris interrupted, his voice steady. "I'm offering you a way out, Catherine. A chance to rebuild. I have resources. I can give you the stability you need, the support. But you have to let me help you. I can't just walk away from you again. Not now. Not after seeing you like this." For a moment, Catherine didn't speak. Her face contorted as though she was struggling to process the offer. Chris could see the battle within her. This was so much more than just accepting help. It was about pride, shame, and fear. So much fear. But as she looked into his eyes, Chris could see the smallest glimmer of hope flicker in her expression. A hope that had been buried under years of struggle, but was now rising to the surface. "I don't know what to say," Catherine said softly, her voice breaking. "I don't know if I deserve it. I don't know if I can accept it." "Of course you deserve it," Chris replied, his tone firm and unwavering. "You and your kids deserve a life better than this. I've seen what you've been through, and I'm not going to let you do it alone anymore." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, Chris feared she might break down right there in front of him. But instead, Catherine swallowed hard and nodded, a shaky breath escaping her lips. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, I'll accept your help. I don't know how to thank you." The words hung in the air between them, but Chris could see the relief in her face, the weight that seemed to lift from her shoulders. He knew this was just the beginning. There was still so much to rebuild, so much damage to undo. But this was a start, a glimmer of hope, like a light in the darkness. Chris extended a hand toward her, a silent promise that he would be there for her. And after a moment of hesitation, Catherine took his hand, her fingers trembling as they clasped around his. In that simple gesture, something passed between them, an unspoken understanding that they were no longer living in the past, but in the present, where the future could still be rewritten. Emily and Liam looked up at them, their faces full of uncertainty, but there was also something else, a flicker of trust, as if they too felt the shift in the air. The world around them had not changed, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like they had a chance. "Thank you," Catherine said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Chris didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. His actions would speak louder than words ever could. They stood there together, in the middle of the street, a broken past behind them and a new future, one filled with unknowns, stretching ahead. The days following Catherine's acceptance of Chris's help were a blur, filled with phone calls, paperwork, and tense conversations. Despite the relief that had flooded through Catherine's body when she agreed to accept his offer, it wasn't as simple as handing her a check and offering a place to stay. No, this was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey, a journey neither of them had been prepared for. Chris knew it wouldn't be easy. He had the resources, the connections, but even he couldn't deny the complexity of the situation. He had always prided himself on being in control, of handling challenges with calculated precision. But this was different. This wasn't business. This wasn't a problem that could be solved with the right strategy. This was about real lives, Catherine's, her children's, and his own. The first step was getting Catherine and her kids out of the cramped, run-down shelter they had been staying in. It was clear to Chris that her pride would never allow her to ask for more than the basics, but he knew he had to do more than offer her a roof. He couldn't just give her a house. He had to give her a home, a sense of security, a foundation to rebuild on. He had already contacted a reputable rehabilitation center for Catherine, a place where she could get the care and emotional support she desperately needed. He arranged for a fully furnished apartment in a safer part of town, far removed from the dark corners of the city where Catherine had been trying to survive. The apartment was bright and modern, complete with a small garden where the kids could play, a stark contrast to the cold streets and alleyways they had known for so long. But when it came to telling Catherine, it was harder than he had anticipated. He couldn't help but feel like he was overstepping, like she might resent his good intentions. What if she didn't want all of this? What if she thought he was trying to buy her redemption, fix everything with money and material things? He found himself pacing in his office, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. Was he really doing this for Catherine, or was it for himself, for his own peace of mind, for the guilt that had been eating at him for years? It was late in the evening when he finally picked up the phone to call her. His heart raced as the dial tone echoed in his ear, the nervous energy making him second-guess everything. When Catherine finally picked up, her voice was quiet, guarded. "Chris?" she asked, as though she wasn't quite sure what to expect from him now. "Hey, Catherine," Chris said, taking a deep breath to steady his nerves. "I've been thinking a lot about everything we talked about, and I want to make sure you and the kids have everything you need." There was a pause on the other end, and Chris's chest tightened. He knew she was listening carefully, processing his words, unsure of what he was about to say. "I've made arrangements," Chris continued, his voice firm but kind. "I've secured an apartment for you and the kids. It's fully furnished, everything you'll need to start over. It's a safe place, Catherine. A fresh start." The silence on the line felt like an eternity, and Chris began to doubt himself. He had hoped she would be relieved, that this would be the solution she'd been waiting for, but instead, there was nothing but quiet. "I know this is a lot," Chris added quickly, "but I just want to make sure you and the kids have a chance to live without worrying every day. You deserve more than what you've been going through." Finally, Catherine spoke, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Chris, I don't know what to say. I didn't expect you to do all this." Chris swallowed, his throat tight. "You don't have to say anything. I'm not asking for anything in return. I just want to help." There was a long pause, and Chris could almost hear the whirlwind of emotions running through her. It was clear she was struggling to accept what he was offering, to trust that someone truly wanted to help without expecting something in return. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. "After everything that happened, you don't owe me anything." "I know," Chris replied, his voice steady, though his heart ached for the vulnerability in her words. "I don't owe you anything, but I can't ignore the fact that you're here, struggling, with no one to turn to. And maybe I can't fix everything, but I can help. I want to make things right. Not for me, but for you. For Emily. For Liam." Catherine didn't answer right away, but Chris could feel her processing, her hesitation. He could hear the mix of emotions in her voice as she finally spoke again. "This feels too good to be true, Chris," she whispered. "I don't know if I can trust it." Chris's heart clenched, and he felt the full weight of the reality of Catherine's situation. She had been let down by so many people, had been forced to fight for every scrap of dignity, and now here he was, offering her everything she had lost faith in. She wasn't just skeptical of him, she was skeptical of the world. "Trust me, Catherine," Chris said, his voice full of quiet conviction. "I'm not going anywhere. This is real. You and your kids are going to be safe. You don't have to do this alone anymore." Catherine exhaled slowly, and for the first time since they had reconnected, Chris felt like he was finally breaking through the walls she had built. Slowly, she agreed to meet him at the new apartment the next day. The phone call ended, and Chris sat there for a long moment, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was the first real step toward healing, not just for Catherine, but for him too. Helping her wasn't just about righting a wrong, it was about giving them both the opportunity to move forward, to start fresh. The next morning, when Chris arrived at the apartment, the weight of the moment hit him again. He could hear the distant sound of children laughing in the hallway, and his heart lifted. This was it. This was where Catherine and her kids would begin their new life. When Catherine arrived, the shock on her face was unmistakable. She stood in the doorway, staring at the spacious, clean apartment in disbelief. The children peeked inside, their eyes wide with wonder at the new place. It was too much to take in, too overwhelming. You didn't have to do all this," Catherine said, her voice shaky with emotion. "I know," Chris replied, his expression softening. "But I wanted to. I want to help. To give you a future, not just today." The tears in Catherine's eyes were quiet at first, but then they came, unbidden, as she stepped forward into the apartment. She didn't say anything, she didn't have to. Her embrace was everything he needed to know. Catherine sat on the couch, her hands resting on her lap as she stared blankly at the walls of the new apartment. It was everything Chris had promised, a safe space, a clean, quiet home where the children could sleep soundly without the fear of the night creeping in. Emily and Liam were in their rooms, playing with the toys Chris had arranged for them the day before. They were happy, at least for now, their laughter a distant sound that felt both foreign and familiar to Catherine. She tried to relax, but her mind was in turmoil. The apartment was a sanctuary, yes, but it also felt like a prison. She couldn't help but feel like a stranger in her own life, as though this wasn't the world she belonged in. Everything about it felt out of place, too perfect, too unreal. It was as if she was still waiting for the other shoe to drop, still waiting for the inevitable disappointment, the sharp sting of betrayal. She had never been allowed to believe in good things for too long. Was this another illusion? Maybe I don't deserve this, she thought, her mind spiraling. She could still feel the weight of her past pressing down on her, haunting her at every turn. The years of struggle, the nights spent on the streets with her children, those feelings of hopelessness that had almost become a part of her. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the thoughts that were suffocating her. The sound of children's laughter continued in the background, but it only amplified the hollow emptiness inside her. It was in moments like this, when everything was supposed to be getting better, that she felt the most lost. Chris, on the other hand, was not in the apartment. He had left after their quiet exchange that morning, feeling the weight of his decision pressing heavily on him. He had done the right thing, he was sure of that, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He couldn't ignore the gnawing doubt in his gut, the uneasy realization that helping Catherine might not be as simple as he had thought. He'd always been a man of action, of problem-solving, but this was different. It wasn't just about offering her a way out of her old life. It was about rebuilding her sense of self, her trust in the world, and most importantly in him. And that was something Chris wasn't sure he was ready for. As he sat in his office, going over some paperwork, his thoughts drifted back to Catherine. He couldn't help but wonder, was she really ready to accept this new life? Or was she simply going through the motions because she didn't have any other choice? Chris had seen the way Catherine had reacted to the apartment. The disbelief in her eyes, the hesitancy in her voice. It was clear that she was struggling with something much deeper than the surface level. And yet, he couldn't understand why. Why wouldn't she accept the help? Why wouldn't she just let herself believe that she was worth it? The truth was, Chris was terrified. Terrified that this wasn't going to work, that the gulf between them was too wide to bridge. He had hoped that providing her with material things, food, shelter, security, would be enough, but now, sitting alone in his office, he realized that he had overlooked something vital. He had overlooked the emotional scars Catherine had carried with her for so long. She wasn't just a woman who needed a home. She was a woman who needed to find herself again, to heal those invisible wounds that had festered for far too long. And that was a process Chris couldn't control, no matter how hard he tried. He stood up abruptly, running a hand through his hair. He needed to talk to her. He needed to understand what was going on inside her mind, what was holding her back from fully embracing this opportunity. Later that evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Chris called Catherine. His heart raced as the phone rang, unsure of what kind of conversation he was about to walk into. When she answered, her voice was soft, guarded. "Hi, Catherine," Chris said, trying to keep his tone casual, though he could feel the tension building in his chest. "How are you doing? How are the kids?" "They're fine," Catherine replied, her voice strained. "They like the apartment." "Good," Chris said, feeling a flicker of relief. "That's a good sign." There was a pause before Catherine spoke again, and Chris could tell that something was on her mind. "Chris, I don't know if I'm ready for all of this. It's too much. I don't even know where to start." His heart sank. "What do you mean?" I thought we were moving forward. I don't know how to let myself believe it," Catherine said quietly, her voice trembling. This isn't real. I'm not used to this kind of life. I'm not used to feeling safe. I don't know if I can just switch off the fear." Chris felt a pang of guilt. He had thought he could fix everything. He had thought that by giving her a place to stay, by giving her the basics, he could somehow erase the pain. But Catherine's words stung. She wasn't asking for comfort or luxury. She was asking for the one thing he hadn't known how to give her, the time and space to heal. "I understand," Chris said, his voice softer now. "I'm not asking you to be okay overnight. I just want to help, Catherine. I just want to make sure you're safe, that you and the kids have a chance. But I can't make this decision for you. You have to take that first step." Catherine was quiet for a long time. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. Chris took a deep breath. "It's okay. You don't have to do it alone. But I need you to at least try, Catherine. For yourself. For the kids." "I'll try," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. As the conversation ended, Chris's heart ached. This wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be a simple road to redemption. There would be setbacks. There would be days when Catherine felt like giving up. But Chris knew that if he truly wanted to help her, he would need to be patient. He would need to let her find her own way. But he would be there for her, every step of the way. Catherine hung up the phone, her fingers still trembling. She didn't know if she could do this. The fear still clawed at her, gnawing at the edges of her confidence. But for the first time in a long time, there was a small flicker of hope, a faint light at the end of the tunnel. She wasn't sure if she was ready to walk toward it, but she couldn't deny the pull. The next step was hers to take. The days after Chris's call had been both difficult and illuminating for Catherine. As she watched her children settle into their new surroundings, the tension in her chest slowly began to loosen. They were safe. For the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe without constantly worrying about where their next meal would come from or whether the cold would drive them back to the streets. The apartment, the toys, the clothes, everything felt like a dream, too good to be true. But deep down, she knew she couldn't keep running from the reality that she had a responsibility now. She had to rebuild herself, not just for her children, but for her own sake. Catherine had spent so many years living in survival mode, her every thought consumed by the next crisis, the next hurdle. But now, in the stillness of the apartment, with the sound of her children's laughter echoing in the rooms, Catherine was forced to confront the truth. She had been so focused on the idea of surviving, of merely getting by, that she had forgotten what it meant to truly live. She didn't know where to begin. It felt like starting over was an impossible task. What was she supposed to do first? Was it getting a job? Was it figuring out how to provide for her kids long term? Or was it something deeper, learning to trust again, to believe in herself and in others? She sat at the kitchen table one evening, looking at the list of job openings she had printed out earlier. The paper felt like a weight in her hands. Her mind was still clouded with doubt. How could she return to work after all this time? Would anyone even hire someone like her? Was she really ready to face the world again? What if I fail? The question circled endlessly in her mind. And yet, a voice in the back of her head kept pushing her forward. You have to try. But how? Chris had always been a man of certainty. His life was defined by routines, strategies, and a deep understanding of the world around him. He had always known what to do in any situation, except when it came to Catherine. This wasn't just about charity or a business transaction. This was about real life, real people, with real emotions and struggles. It wasn't about solving a problem. It was about supporting someone in their journey of healing. And that was what made it so complicated. The past few days had shown Chris just how much he had underestimated Catherine's emotional baggage. He had thought that by giving her a home, he was providing her with everything she needed. But now, as he watched her struggle to find her footing, he realized that there was so much more to it than that. He had offered her the resources, the security, but he couldn't give her the confidence, the strength to move past her past. That was something only she could find within herself. And that was the part he didn't know how to help her with. As Chris walked back into his office after another long meeting, his mind immediately went to Catherine. He couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and frustration. He was proud that she had taken the first step, accepting his help, moving into the apartment, but at the same time, he felt like there was so much more to do. He wanted to fix everything for her, to take away her fear and uncertainty, but he knew that wasn't possible. His phone buzzed with a message from Catherine. It had been a few days since their last conversation, and Chris had been giving her space to adjust. He opened the text, his heart racing as he read her words. I think I want to go back to work. For a moment, Chris wasn't sure how to respond. Was she ready for that? Was she truly prepared to face the challenges that would come with trying to rebuild her life? Part of him wanted to tell her to take her time, to focus on healing first, but he also understood the importance of taking that step. She needed to feel that she could contribute, that she wasn't just relying on him. He thought for a moment before typing back. That's a great step, Catherine. I know it's scary, but I believe in you. If you need any help, I'm here. He sent the message and set the phone down. As much as he wanted to guide her through this, he knew that the real journey would be hers to walk. Catherine sat at the table, her phone in front of her, staring at Chris's response. His words were kind, supportive, but they also made her feel something unexpected. Hope. She wasn't sure she deserved it, but the thought of trying to return to work filled her with a spark of something she hadn't felt in years. Maybe I can do this. The realization hit her slowly. She didn't have to have all the answers right away. She didn't have to fix everything in one go. But if she could take that first step, get a job, get back into the world, maybe, just maybe, she could begin to put the pieces of her life back together. It wasn't going to be easy. Catherine knew that better than anyone. But for the first time in a long time, she was willing to try. The next day, Catherine called one of the job openings she had found. The voice on the other end was warm and welcoming, and after a brief conversation, Catherine had set up an interview for the following week. It wasn't the ideal job, nothing glamorous or high-paying, but it was a start. It was something that would give her a routine, a sense of purpose. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. When she hung up the phone, she took a deep breath. The weight in her chest had eased just a little. She had taken the first step. Now she had to keep moving forward, one step at a time. That evening, as she sat on the couch with Emily and Liam, Catherine felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The apartment wasn't just a place to live anymore. It was a place where she could start over. And as the kids snuggled against her, she realized that this was the beginning of something new, something she had once thought was impossible. But it wasn't just about the apartment, the job, or the security. It was about her finding her strength again. It was about reclaiming her life, piece by piece, and learning to believe in herself once more. She looked down at Liam and Emily, their faces peaceful in sleep, and felt a surge of love and determination. For them. For herself. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, Catherine felt ready to face it. Catherine had barely slept the night before her first day at work. Her mind had been racing, thinking about the interview, the job, and the uncertainty that still gripped her heart. Could she really do this? Could she be the woman her children needed? Could she handle the pressure of getting back into the world after so long? The morning had arrived too quickly, and as she stood in front of the mirror, she hardly recognized the woman staring back at her. She was dressed in a simple blouse and skirt, nothing extravagant, but enough to make her feel somewhat like a professional again. The clothes felt unfamiliar against her skin, as if they didn't quite belong to her anymore. She took a deep breath, adjusting the collar of her shirt, and forced herself to smile. "You can do this," she reminded herself, though the words felt more like a prayer than a truth. She had no choice but to try. Her children were depending on her, and she couldn't let them down. When she walked into the small office building, she was greeted by the receptionist, a friendly woman named Karen, who gave her a warm smile. "You must be Catherine. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here." Catherine managed a smile in return, her heart beating faster as Karen led her to her desk. The office was small, but the people seemed kind enough. They greeted her with polite smiles, though there was a slight hesitance in their eyes as they tried to place her. Catherine knew what they were thinking. They probably wondered who she was, what her story was. But she didn't have time to dwell on that. She had a job to do. Her first task was simple: answering phones, directing calls, sorting through paperwork. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. And as she settled into the rhythm of the work, a small part of her began to relax. There was something comforting in the routine, in the predictable flow of the day. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt like she belonged somewhere. Meanwhile, Chris sat in his office, staring at the papers in front of him, but hardly able to focus. His mind kept wandering back to Catherine. He had sent her a text that morning, wishing her good luck on her first day, but he hadn't heard from her since. He understood that she needed space, needed to focus on herself, but a part of him couldn't help but wonder how she was doing. Was she okay? Was she adjusting? He knew he had to let go, to give her the room she needed to build her new life. But there was an undeniable pull in his chest, an ache that he couldn't ignore. He wanted to be there for her, to support her in every way possible. But he also knew that this was her journey, not his. And as much as he wanted to play the role of the hero, he had to respect her independence. Later that afternoon, as Catherine sat at her desk, she found herself distracted by the weight of her thoughts. She was doing the work, keeping up with the tasks, but her mind kept drifting back to Chris. She hadn't talked to him much in the past few days, not since their last conversation about her taking this job. She knew he was probably busy with his own life, but a small part of her still wished he would check in, ask how she was really doing. "Why do I care so much?" she wondered. She had told herself over and over that she wasn't looking for anything more than a way out of her past. She wasn't ready to open herself up again, especially to someone like Chris, who seemed to have everything figured out while she was still struggling to find her place. But as much as she tried to push the thought away, she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him. There was something about Chris, his kindness, his quiet strength, that made her feel safe in a way she hadn't felt in years. And yet, she was still afraid. Afraid to trust, afraid to lean on him, afraid to let her guard down. As the clock ticked toward the end of the day, Catherine gathered her things and stood up, ready to leave. The office had quieted down, and she was eager to get home to her children. But just as she was about to leave, Karen approached her. "You did great today, Catherine," she said, her smile warm. "We're really glad to have you here. I hope you feel comfortable in the office." Catherine nodded, surprised by the sincerity in Karen's voice. "Thank you. I'm glad to be here." As she walked out of the building, Catherine felt a small spark of pride inside her. She had made it through her first day, and she hadn't fallen apart. It wasn't easy, but she had done it. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something bigger. That evening, Chris sent her another message. "How was your first day?" Catherine read the text, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She had been hesitant to reply earlier, unsure of what to say, but now, with the day behind her, she felt more grounded. She took a deep breath before typing back. "It was good. I'm still getting used to everything, but it felt like a step forward." Chris's reply came quickly. "I'm so proud of you. One step at a time, right?" Catherine smiled, feeling a mixture of gratitude and something else, something deeper than she had anticipated. It was a strange feeling, this quiet hope that had begun to settle in her heart. Yeah, she thought. One step at a time. The next few weeks passed in a blur of work, home life, and small victories. Catherine's confidence continued to grow as she got more comfortable in her job, handling more responsibilities and gaining the respect of her co-workers. She was no longer just surviving, she was building a life, one piece at a time. But even as she moved forward, she couldn't shake the thought of Chris. He had become a constant presence in her mind, his messages, his support, always there in the background. And though she hadn't let herself acknowledge it before, the truth was clear now. She was starting to care about him. Maybe more than she was ready to admit. That evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Catherine sat down with a cup of tea, looking out the window. She thought about how far she had come in such a short time, how much she had changed. It wasn't just the job, the apartment, or the security. It was her. She was changing, learning to trust again, learning to believe that she could have more than just a life of survival. She could have a future. She picked up her phone and sent Chris a message. "Thank you for everything. I wouldn't be here without your support." The reply came almost instantly. "I'm just glad I could help. You've done all the hard work, Catherine. I'm proud of you." As she read his words, a wave of emotion hit her. She didn't know what the future held, or where this journey would take her, but for the first time, she felt ready to find out. Catherine stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of her jacket for what felt like the 100th time. Her reflection stared back at her, a woman who had changed in ways she could hardly recognize. The apartment was no longer just a temporary shelter. It had become a home. The job that once felt like a distant dream was now part of her routine, a way to not only support her children, but also to rediscover herself. But as she prepared for another day at work, there was a part of her that was unsettled. Her relationship with Chris had become more complicated than she had ever expected. He had been there for her in ways that no one else had, offering support when she needed it most. But as the days turned into weeks, Catherine began to realize something. She was no longer just grateful for him. She was beginning to care for him in a way that went beyond friendship, beyond gratitude. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. She had promised herself that she wouldn't let herself get too close to anyone, not after everything she had been through. But Chris had a way of breaking down the walls she had so carefully built around herself. His kindness, his quiet strength, it was more than she had ever hoped for, and yet, she wasn't sure if she was ready to let him in completely. Her phone buzzed, breaking her from her thoughts. It was a message from Chris. "I hope your day goes smoothly. You're doing amazing, Catherine." She smiled as she read the words. He had been sending her little messages of encouragement every day, and it always made her heart flutter. But this one felt different. It wasn't just supportive, it was almost like a reassurance. "I'm here for you." And that was the problem. Catherine wasn't sure if she was ready for someone to be so constant, so present in her life. She had spent so many years trying to take care of herself and her children, building a life on her own. The idea of leaning on someone else felt like a luxury she wasn't sure she deserved. "Thank you," she typed back quickly, keeping it brief as she put her phone down. She needed to focus on the day ahead. Chris, on the other hand, was struggling with his own feelings. He had been a rock for Catherine, supporting her as she navigated her new life, but over time, he had realized something that made his chest tighten every time he thought about it. He was falling for her. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Catherine was a woman with a past, a complicated one, and he had no idea if she even saw him the way he saw her. But every time they spoke, every time she sent him one of those messages, every time he saw her smile or heard the softness in her voice, he couldn't deny the connection he felt. But he also knew that this wasn't about him. This was about Catherine and her journey. She had been through so much, and he didn't want to complicate things for her. She needed time to find herself, to heal. And yet, the more time they spent together, the more difficult it became to ignore the feelings growing inside him. He had tried to keep his distance, to be the supportive friend without crossing any lines, but it was getting harder. He wasn't sure if he was ready to confront the emotions stirring within him. And he definitely wasn't sure if Catherine was ready for anything beyond what they had built so far. The next day at work, Catherine found herself distracted, her mind constantly wandering back to Chris. She tried to focus on the tasks at hand, sorting paperwork, answering phones, attending to clients, but it was impossible to ignore the constant tug in her chest. She knew she was thinking about him too much. She knew it wasn't healthy to let someone occupy so much of her thoughts, especially when she still had so much of her own life to figure out. At lunch, she found herself scrolling through her phone, her finger hovering over Chris's contact name. She had sent him a quick message earlier in the morning, but now she wanted to say more. She wanted to ask him how he was doing, to let him know that she appreciated him in a way that was beyond just the surface-level gratitude. But she didn't know if it was the right time. What if I say the wrong thing? She thought. What if he doesn't feel the same way? She had lived with doubt for so long, questioning every decision she made, every relationship she formed. The idea of letting her guard down, of trusting someone with her heart again, felt like an impossible task. She had been burned before, and the scars were still there, deep beneath the surface. She wasn't sure if she could risk opening herself up to someone, even if it was Chris. She put the phone down, trying to push the thoughts aside. But they lingered like an echo in her mind, reminding her of everything she couldn't say. That evening, after a long day, Catherine sat on the couch, watching Emily and Liam play together on the floor. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but there was a sense of peace that had settled over her. She had made it through another day. She had taken another step forward. But as she sat there, a message from Chris lit up her phone. "I'm going to be in town tomorrow. I'd love to see you if you're free." Catherine stared at the message for a moment, feeling a knot form in her stomach. She hadn't seen him in person in weeks. They had talked, of course, texts, phone calls, but she hadn't been ready for face-to-face contact. Not yet. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keys as she typed a reply. "I think I'd like that." The words felt bold, like something she wasn't quite ready for. But she sent it anyway, her heart racing as soon as the message was sent. This was a step she wasn't sure she was ready for, but something inside her urged her to take it. The next day, as she prepared to meet Chris, Catherine found herself feeling nervous in a way she hadn't expected. It wasn't just the anticipation of seeing him, it was the realization that this was a new chapter, one where things could change between them. She had been guarding her heart for so long, afraid of letting anyone in. But now, standing at the edge of something that felt like it could be more, she wasn't sure what to expect. She arrived at the cafe where they had agreed to meet, her hands trembling slightly as she walked inside. The moment she saw Chris, standing by the window with his back to her, her heart skipped a beat. He turned around as soon as she entered, and for a brief moment, neither of them said anything. They just stood there, looking at each other, a quiet understanding passing between them. "Hey," Chris said softly, his voice warm. "It's good to see you." Catherine nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You too." They sat down together, and for the first time in weeks, the air between them felt different. The conversation flowed easily, but underneath the surface, there was an unspoken tension. Neither of them said what they were really thinking, but they both knew it was there. Catherine had no idea where this was going, but as she looked into Chris's eyes, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The day had arrived. Catherine could feel the weight of it in her chest as she got ready. This wasn't just another day at work or another evening spent with her children. Today was different. Today was about taking the next step, whatever that step might be, and confronting the truth of what had been building between her and Chris. She had spent the past few weeks going back and forth in her mind. She had enjoyed their time together, the way he had supported her, the way he made her feel seen and heard. But there was always a hesitation deep down, a voice that told her not to trust too easily, not to give her heart away so freely. She couldn't afford to fall in love, not with someone who had so much stability, so much to lose, while she was still trying to pick up the pieces of her life. But the truth was that she was falling. Slowly, quietly, but undeniably, she was falling for him. She stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her outfit for their dinner meeting. The reflection staring back at her wasn't just a woman trying to survive anymore. She was a woman who had been rebuilding herself, rediscovering her strength. But tonight, she had to let go of the fear that had always held her back. Her phone buzzed with a message from Chris. "Can't wait to see you tonight. I've been thinking about you." The words hit her harder than she expected. He had been thinking about her. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the wave of emotion pass before taking a deep breath and replying, "I'm looking forward to it." She stared at the screen for a moment longer, then put the phone down. It was time to face whatever this was between them. Chris had been pacing around his apartment all afternoon, trying to focus on work, but his mind kept returning to Catherine. Their last meeting at the cafe had left him feeling more conflicted than ever. The connection between them was undeniable, but there was still so much uncertainty. She was still figuring out her life, still processing everything she had been through. He didn't want to rush her, but the truth was he didn't know how much longer he could hold back. He had made up his mind. Tonight, he would tell her how he felt. He would lay it all on the table. It was time for them to face this together, whatever this was. He thought about the countless hours they had spent texting, the conversations they had shared, the moments of silence that had spoken louder than any words. He knew he was ready for something more. But was she? As he finished getting ready, his phone buzzed with Catherine's reply. A small smile tugged at his lips as he read the words. He had missed her more than he had realized. He had spent so many years keeping his emotions under control, but Catherine had slipped past all of his defenses. And now, he couldn't imagine his life without her in it. Later that evening, As Catherine walked into the restaurant, she felt a surge of nerves hit her. The dim lighting, the soft murmur of conversation, the clinking of glasses, all of it felt like a world she had been away from for too long. But as soon as she saw Chris standing near their table, the nerves melted away. He looked just as handsome as she remembered, his eyes lighting up when he saw her. "Catherine," he said softly, his voice carrying that warmth she had come to cherish. "You look beautiful." She smiled, her heart skipping a beat at his words. "Thank you. You look great, too." They sat down together, the atmosphere between them comfortable but charged with something more, something neither of them was willing to ignore any longer. They ordered their food, but the conversation was slow, almost hesitant, as if they were both unsure of how to bridge the gap between them. Finally, after a few moments of silence, Chris put down his glass of wine and looked at her, his gaze steady. "I've been thinking a lot about us, Catherine. About what this is, what we're doing." Catherine's heart raced, her mind scrambling to find the right words. She knew what he was saying without him having to say it outright. This was the moment where they would either step into something new or walk away, unsure of what could have been. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I've been thinking a lot, too. About everything." Chris leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "I don't want to rush you, Catherine. I know you've been through a lot, and I'm not expecting anything from you. But I can't keep pretending that I don't care about you. I care about you more than I ever thought possible. And I want to be here for you. I want to be part of your life, whatever that looks like." Catherine's chest tightened, her emotions swirling inside her. She had spent so long protecting herself, keeping her heart guarded. But there was something in Chris's words, in his eyes, that made it impossible to ignore the truth any longer. She had fallen for him, too. She had been afraid to admit it, afraid to trust that he would stick around, but now, with him sitting right there, so open and vulnerable, she couldn't deny it. "I care about you, too," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't want to admit it, because I didn't know if I could handle another heartbreak. But I trust you, Chris. I trust you more than I thought I could trust anyone." The words hung in the air between them, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. But then Chris reached across the table, taking her hand in his. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. It was a promise that they would face whatever came next together. "I'm not going anywhere, Catherine," he said quietly. "I'm here for you, for the kids. We'll take this one step at a time, okay?" Tears welled in Catherine's eyes as she squeezed his hand. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. She felt like she could finally let go of the fear that had been holding her back. She had found someone who truly saw her, who wanted to be there through the ups and downs. "Okay," she whispered. "One step at a time." As the evening wore on, they talked, laughed, and shared stories. It was as if a weight had been lifted from both of their shoulders. There was no more uncertainty, no more hesitation. They had finally crossed the threshold together, and now, there was nothing left to do but embrace whatever came next. As they left the restaurant, Chris walked her to her car, his hand still gently holding hers. He stopped at the door, looking at her with a tenderness that made her heart swell. "I'm glad we're here, Catherine," he said, his voice soft. "I'm glad we're doing this together." "Me too," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She smiled up at him, the future feeling wide open, full of possibilities. And as they shared a lingering kiss beneath the streetlight, Catherine knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. One step at a time,